What if a teenage prince with barely a few thousand soldiers stood between his homeland and a full-scale invasion, and won a battle that changed the destiny of an entire region forever? In the summer of 1240, along the cold, fast-moving waters of the Neva River, history was about to witness exactly that moment. The medieval world of Northern Europe was unstable, fragmented, and violent. Kingdoms rose and fell through steel, faith, and ambition. Trade routes were lifelines, and whoever controlled them controlled wealth, influence, and survival. In this struggle for dominance, the lands of the Rus, particularly the Republic of Novgorod, stood at a critical crossroads between East and West. Novgorod was not an empire, but it was rich, proud, and strategically vital. It sat along major trade routes connecting the Baltic Sea to inland Russia and beyond. Merchants brought silver, furs, wax, and grain through its markets. Its independence depended not on vast armies, but on diplomacy, local militias, and strong leadership. But in 1240, danger came from the west. A Swedish force, likely supported by Allied crusading ambitions from the broader Baltic region, sailed into the Neva River estuary. Their goal was not simply raiding. It was influence, expansion, and control over the strategic waterways that fed Novgorod's wealth. If they secured the Neva, they could choke Novgorod's access to the Baltic Sea and weaken it economically and politically. This was not a small expedition. Medieval Swedish chroniclers and later interpretations suggest a well-organized force of knights, soldiers, and auxiliaries confident in their naval mobility and battlefield superiority. They expected little resistance deep inside what they believed was fragmented Rus territory. They were wrong, because in Novgorod, a young prince named Alexander Yaroslavich, later known to history as Alexander Nevsky, was watching. At this point in his life, Alexander was not yet the legendary figure Russian history would remember. He was young, likely in his late teens or early 20s, still building his reputation among boyars, warriors, and merchants who often questioned authority. Leadership in Novgorod was not absolute, it was negotiated. Power had to be earned. But Alexander possessed something rare: strategic instinct combined with decisive courage. When word reached Novgorod that a Swedish force had entered the Neva River and established a camp, panic could have spread. The traditional response would have been to gather reinforcements, fortify the city, and wait. That would have been the safe choice. It would also have allowed the enemy to strengthen their position. Alexander chose differently. He decided not to wait. Instead of calling for a prolonged defensive strategy, he gathered what forces he could, primarily the Novgorod militia and allied warriors from nearby regions. It was not a large army. Historical estimates are uncertain, but it is widely believed he commanded a significantly smaller force than the invaders. The imbalance was clear: fewer soldiers, fewer trained knights, and less heavy equipment. But Alexander had something the Swedish force did not expect: speed, knowledge of terrain, and the element of surprise. The Neva River itself played a crucial role. This waterway connects Lake Ladoga to the Gulf of Finland, cutting through dense forests and marshlands. It was not open battlefield terrain. It was narrow in places, heavily forested, and difficult for large formations to maneuver. For an invading force relying on organization and discipline, it could become a trap. Alexander understood this. He marched quickly. No elaborate ceremony. No delay. His forces moved through forests and along river paths with urgency, aiming not to defend Novgorod walls, but to strike the invaders before they could establish full control. This decision alone changed everything. On the Swedish side, the camp was likely positioned near the Neva estuary, where the river widens and meets the Baltic approach routes. They had likely disembarked from ships, set up tents, and begun organizing their position. Confidence was high. There were no reports of immediate resistance. Scouts likely saw no large enemy formations nearby. It must have felt secure. That sense of security would not last. As dawn approached on the day of the battle, Alexander's forces moved into position. The forest around the river was dense, filled with mist rising from the water. Visibility was limited. The ground was uneven and soft, making movement quiet but physically demanding. This environment was perfect for a surprise attack. According to traditional accounts, Alexander split his forces strategically. Some units targeted the main encampment, while others aimed to disrupt escape routes and communication. The goal was not simply confrontation. It was disorientation. Then came the moment of impact. The Novgorod forces struck suddenly, emerging from the forest edges and riverbanks. The first signs of attack were likely arrows and shouting warriors rushing forward at high speed. Swedish soldiers, caught off guard, scrambled to form defensive lines. But formation takes time. And time, in battle, is everything. The initial shock was devastating. Medieval warfare often depended on the first moments of engagement. A surprised army could collapse before it fully organized. Panic spreads faster than orders. The Neva battlefield became chaotic almost immediately. Swedish soldiers attempted to regroup, forming shield walls and defensive clusters. But the terrain worked against them. Narrow spaces near the river limited maneuverability. The forest restricted visibility. Communication broke down under sudden pressure. Meanwhile, Alexander's forces pressed the advantage. One of the most famous elements of the legend is Alexander himself leading from the front. Whether fully accurate in every detail or shaped by later heroic tradition, the image reflects an important truth. Leadership in this battle was direct, visible, and aggressive. Alexander did not command from the rear. He moved with his troops, directing attacks where resistance was strongest. This kind of leadership had a psychological impact. Soldiers fight differently when they see their leaders share their risk. The battle intensified into close combat. Swords clashed against shields. Axes struck armor. Horses moved through mud and uneven ground. The sound of steel and shouting filled the riverbanks. The Neva, calm in appearance from a distance, became a stage of violent chaos. Despite being outnumbered, the Novgorod forces maintained momentum. Their advantage lay in coordination and timing. Every wave of attack reinforced the previous one. The Swedish force, meanwhile, struggled to regain control of formation. As the battle progressed, pressure mounted on the invaders. Some units attempted to retreat toward their ships. Others tried to hold positions near the shoreline. But organized withdrawal under pressure is one of the most difficult maneuvers in warfare. It is often where battles are truly decided. Eventually, the Swedish force began to break. Once cohesion is lost, even well-trained armies become vulnerable. Retreat turned into disorder. Disorder turned into collapse. Novgorod forces pushed forward, exploiting every opening. The battlefield shifted from structured combat to pursuit and fragmentation. By the end of the engagement, the Swedish forces were driven back toward their ships and out of the immediate region. The threat to Novgorod's control of the Neva was neutralized. The victory was decisive. But the significance of the Battle of the Neva goes beyond the immediate military outcome. For Novgorod, this was not just a defensive success. It was a statement. It demonstrated that the city could defend its trade routes and sovereignty against foreign intervention. It strengthened Alexander's political position dramatically. A young leader who had once been viewed cautiously was now seen as a protector of the land. From this moment forward, he would be remembered as Nevsky, Alexander of the Neva. But history rarely ends at the battlefield. The consequences of this victory echoed across northern Europe. It signaled that Novgorod could not be easily dominated from the Baltic direction. It also reshaped Alexander's future decisions as a ruler, influencing how he would later deal with other threats, including the Teutonic Knights and later conflicts. What makes the Battle of the Neva particularly remarkable is not just that it was won, it is how it was won. A smaller force defeated a larger invading army through speed, terrain awareness, and decisive leadership. It was a textbook example of asymmetric warfare centuries before the term existed. But beyond strategy, it also became a symbol. In later Russian historical tradition, Alexander Nevsky became more than a prince. He became a representation of national defense, unity, and resilience against external pressure. His image was preserved in chronicles, religious narratives, and cultural memory. Of course, like many medieval battles, exact numbers and details remain debated among historians. Sources from the 13th century are limited, and later accounts often blend history with legend. But the core event, the Swedish incursion and Novgorod's successful defense under Alexander's command, is widely accepted as historical reality. What remains undeniable is the impact of leadership under pressure. At an age when many leaders hesitate, Alexander chose action. When safety suggested delay, he chose speed. When numbers suggested defeat, he chose strategy. And on the banks of the Neva River, that choice changed everything. The battlefield eventually fell silent. The smoke cleared. The wounded were tended to. The dead were counted. The river continued its flow as it always had, indifferent to human conflict. But history had shifted. A young prince had earned his name. A city had defended its independence. And a moment in 1240 became one of the defining early episodes in the story of medieval Eastern Europe. Even today, the Battle of the Neva is remembered not just as a military encounter, but as a lesson in leadership, courage, and timing. Because sometimes, history does not belong to the wrongest army. It belongs to the one that strikes first, thinks faster, and refuses to hesitate when everything is at stake.